First off, today's lesson is more of a rant than a lesson. So if you're the kind of person who gets to the end of the video and goes, oh man, nobody showed me how to play anything today, this video is probably not for you. I was just going to save you 7 minutes and say, go watch one of the other 100 lessons on the channel where I actually break down stuff note for note. Today, I just want to talk about blues and jazz, fingerstyle guitar and not fingerstyle guitar. And particularly since I have been doing these workshops on Freddie Green chords and swing scales and bebop licks, and I mostly teach fingerstyle guitar, I want to just explain a little bit of the logic of how those two things go together to me and why you might want to work on both of them, not necessarily just one or the other. Now, on some level, I don't really consider myself thoroughly qualified either as a blues guitar player or as a jazz guitar player, mostly because somehow I have just never cared enough about doing it exactly right, whatever that means. There are blues guitar players that I completely admire who know chapter and verse on every recording, every style, every pre-war guitar player, every post-war guitar player. They know it all. They know what gear they use. They know what licks they played. They know what labels they recorded for. And they can sit down and reproduce a dazzling number of styles for you at the drop of a hat. And it's amazing. As I have mentioned elsewhere, I never quite managed to have access to the recordings that would have let me figure that stuff out at an early enough age when I was still obsessive enough to learn that kind of stuff. So I learned a lot of secondhand things from 60s era folk revival guitar players instead. And as far as jazz goes, that's something I certainly, took a running jump at trying to do, but it's a huge amount of repertoire. It's a huge amount of history. It's a huge amount of everything. And for whatever reason, I didn't have the disposition to digest all of that, which leaves me here in the middle as someone who loves both blues and jazz more than just about any other kind of music. And so it's pretty much everyone's prerogative to figure out what they're going to take from the things that they like and turn it into what they want to do. And all of my favorite musicians really are people who, without them, that thing wouldn't exist. So I'm talking about musicians like Mose Allison or Ry Cooder or Charlie Christian. I mean, people who came along and basically, if you took them out of the picture, there'd be this gaping hole in 20th century roots music. And those are the kinds of people I've always liked. So while I'm not comparing myself to the accomplishments of any of those people I mentioned, I will say that I think there's something valuable in recognizing that this is a possible path. Not necessarily to say, if I can't play exactly like so-and-so, I've failed, but rather to say, if I've managed to synthesize the things that I love into something that makes me happy as a musician, I have succeeded. And I think that that is a worthwhile distinction to make. So as far as blues and jazz go, in terms of technique and style, I love the idea of self-accompanied solo guitar playing. And so every fingerstyle guitar player I could get my hands on and could learn something from was another piece of the puzzle going, oh, you can put it together that way. You can put it together this way. You can hold down the bass this way. You can make these things happen on top. Wonderful. I love it. That's what I want to be able to do, just to sit and groove and improvise and play and make something that sounds really good all by myself. So that's a piece of the puzzle, right? That's what you can draw from the great fingerstyle guitar players. And then on the flip side, when I heard people like Charlie Christian or Oscar Peterson or Stanley Turrentine or any of these great jazz soloists, I was like, man, I love the vocabulary. I love the way it's bluesy, but it's a little more intricate, or a lot more intricate. The linear quality of it, the sophistication of the chord changes, the kinds of licks and lines they're playing. This is really wonderful. Upon breaking that down a little further, I didn't have the interest or the inclination or the capacity or whatever it was you need to have that kind of jazz musician's universality, where it doesn't matter what tempo, it doesn't matter what key, it doesn't matter what changes, you are ready for it all. Now, side note, I don't think that many or most jazz musicians actually have that kind of universal capacity. Certainly most of my favorite musicians, you could have taken them out of one context and put them in another, and it might not have gone so great, but that's a discussion for another time. The point is, there's something to draw from that, which I ultimately narrow down to, I love the way jazz musicians play on the blues. I think it's fascinating. And what do you know? It dovetails with the fact that I love the way blues musicians play. So here are these two different things, and can they be reconciled in any way? And what happens when you try to collide those things into one place? So this is how I have found myself somewhere in the middle of this Venn diagram between blues and jazz, which is not necessarily a bad place to be. It's just we all have this kind of tendency to want to quantify or identify what we are as a musician. And so I find myself saying, well, I'm not really a blues musician. I'm not really a jazz musician. I don't really know what to call it. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter, and that is why I find myself spending time talking about things like, how to keep a steady bass going or how to make a walking bass line move, but also how to think about what notes you're playing over the chord changes and how to think beyond, pentatonic scales to actually address those chords and play licks that match what you're doing. So when it's fingerstyle, there's a really high technique bar because getting the ideas to work requires a lot of this, just a lot of coordination. So I spend a lot of time on that because I'm really interested in it and because it's what you need to be able to execute as a solo guitar player. Looking at things like chord voicings and scales and licks and chord substitutions and altered scales and diminished scales and all that kind of stuff is really just a way of taking one aspect of playing fingerstyle guitar and viewing it in isolation and saying, okay, well, if you want to be able to put licks over the chords, then you need to understand what's going on top. And so looking at the way swing and bebop musicians play on the changes, the way they solo and improvise, is a way of divorcing the improvising part of it from the technique part of it that you have to address to play fingerstyle blues. And so if you can step away momentarily from the technical demands of doing everything at once and just look at the improvising part, then even if you are not interested in being a single note bebop soloist, you can take the time to look at those ideas in isolation and go, oh, that's how it works. And then bring it back to fingerstyle guitar and go, and now let's put that on the fingerboard along with this. So that idea of taking things in isolation for the improvisation part, that's one reason that I remain fascinated with that kind of music myself as a resource for understanding that, because those musicians in the swing and bebop world have really taken that approach to the nth degree. They're the best at it, so why not look at how they do it and then bring it back to fingerstyle guitar? At the same time, I'm also aware there are plenty of people here on the channel and elsewhere out in the wider world who are like, yeah, I'm never going to be interested in fingerstyle. It's just not my thing, or I've tried it and it's not really within my capacities, but I'm still interested in single note soloing. And since I really enjoy looking at that and talking about it, I feel like it's fun to spend time talking about that here as well for anybody who's here because of that. So that's kind of the layout of how those two things go together in my mind. And hopefully that explanation maybe gives you some ideas for why you might want to spend a little time on that, even if you're primarily a fingerstyle musician. So that is all I have to say about that today. Next week, I will be doing some additional short lessons on a few bebop ideas, answering questions about my upcoming workshop, Bebop for Beginners, which is happening Saturday, June 24th. And you can, of course, find out more about that at the link below or the link on screen. And in the meantime, if you've got a question or a comment or a thought of your own about today's topic, I would love to hear from you. Please leave your comments down below. And as ever, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.